Fantastic, thank you. Well, hello everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me today. I love a good opportunity to think about the intersections between medicine and politics. Probably as somebody who started out as a PPE graduate here many years ago, then became a current affairs journalist, and then switched completely and became a doctor, but have continued being very, very interested in politics and how politicians use the media in a day-to-day way. And I guess times of crisis, whether it's a pandemic, COVID, or the appalling events that are happening in Ukraine at the moment, times of crisis seem to me to be those moments when suddenly everything intersects with absolutely deadly seriousness. So in a pandemic, it was abundantly clear from the outset that the stories that were being told in the media about COVID, about what was happening in our hospitals, about our safety, about how we were being protected or not, those stories and the ways in which they were being presented by the government and by other interested parties potentially had a direct effect on loss of life and on how many people were actually succumbing to COVID, and not just to COVID, how many lives were being lost in other ways, such as through missed operations, through people not coming into hospital for other reasons, perhaps because they were suffering from serious mental health conditions and weren't able to access care at home, all those kinds of issues. And I think that's really what I wanted to talk about briefly today as a starting point for discussion. In the early days of the pandemic, and it seems about 100 years ago now because we're focused so much on Ukraine, but back in this time exactly 2 years ago, so in March, February 2020, when COVID started appearing in the UK, it was such an incredibly chaotic time within the NHS. This was a completely new disease. We had no treatments whatsoever. We had no vaccines. We didn't even have very much PPE. And all of a sudden we were managing at speed these exponentially rising numbers of patients in an incredibly dramatic, chaotic, frightening, genuinely frightening way, knowing that our lives were potentially at risk. In February, there were some very high profile on social media cases of particular doctors in China who died from COVID. There was one in particular called Li Wenliang, who was an ophthalmologist who tried to blow the whistle about this deadly new disease that was spreading across his hospital, and he was shut down by the Chinese state, caught the disease himself, live tweeted or used Weibo, the Chinese equivalent, to post pictures of himself as he succumbed in his hospital, and then ultimately died and became a cause célèbre around the world. So we were kind of watching these things before we started treating COVID ourselves. I'm a palliative care doctor, so I have been a doctor now for 12 years, and I chose to specialise in palliative medicine in particular because all patients are vulnerable. There are huge socioeconomic gradients in health, and if you are a well-educated, powerful doctor, and you are powerful, you have status in society, then you've got a voice and you can try and use it to advocate for patients. And I really wanted to be advocating for a particularly vulnerable group of patients, and there are lots of these: people with disabilities, people with mental health conditions, and definitely patients at the end of life. They're really vulnerable. They can get overlooked very, very easily in a busy, overwhelmed, understaffed health service. So I'm a palliative care doctor, and when the pandemic began, I was working in a little hospice just north of Oxford near Banbury. And I immediately realised that the bulk of the cases were probably going to be in the main hospital rather than the hospice. So I asked if I could be redeployed onto the acute hospital wards in Oxford and in the Horton Hospital in Banbury, where we were likely to be seeing cases of COVID. And that's what I did in the first wave in March, April, May, and then the second wave in January last year. And I also was very outspoken throughout the pandemic. I've got quite a big following on social media, on Twitter, and I always try and use that for one reason alone, really, which is my Twitter feed is really boring. It's 98% NHS campaigning, patient campaigning, speaking out about often government dishonesty as I see it about the NHS, and I do all of that because I feel it's an extension of my medicine. It's part of trying to help patients. And what I thought I would do in this brief talk is just first of all tell you a little bit about what it was like inside the NHS behind those closed hospital doors in the pandemic, and then tell you, I guess, the two key lessons that I have taken from that horrible experience, and reflect briefly on what they have taught me about our political system, the media, and ourselves in a time of crisis and upheaval, which the pandemic most definitely has been. And excuse me, I think times of upheaval are interesting. So when COVID arrived and cases really started escalating in this country, there was lots of, I think, appropriately lurid press coverage of those first weeks, and phrases like apocalyptic were bandied around a lot by the journalists, but actually accurately, in my view. And I think the idea of that first wave being an apocalypse is interesting because the Greek etymology of that word apocalypse, so apocalypsis, means a revelation. So something is revealed, a truth is revealed in a time of apocalypse, in that tumult and upheaval. And that's certainly been my experience. I've learned more about medicine, what matters in medicine, and about the society I live in the last 2 years than at any other point in my life. And unlike most of you, not all of you, but most of you, I've been kicking around for virtually half a century, and these 2 years have been extraordinary. So first of all, I'll just try to give you a flavour of what it was like. So I'm imagining, were most of you locked down, so you weren't going inside a hospital at all? Pretty much, okay. And I should say I'm going to talk quite honestly about what it was like. So forgive me if that's going to touch a raw nerve for anybody. I'm not going to be I'm not going to dwell too much on the details, but it was really tough inside the hospital. So everyone was locked down, and you inhabited this strange world where everything had changed. I found the world of lockdown a completely alien concept because I was just doing my normal job, seeing my normal colleagues at work, only in incredibly difficult, arduous circumstances. So lockdown didn't really exist for NHS staff, and I would go to work on the empty M40 up to the hospital in Banbury, and it was all very 28 days later, you know, it was a bit like a sort of post-nuclear landscape. Nobody was around, but inside the hospital it was full-on chaos activity, and we were all just working as hard as we've ever worked in our lives. It was very frightening. You knew that your natural instinct as a doctor to kind of move towards your patient, to go to their bedside, to help them, always being mitigated by another impulse, which was to recoil from those patients because you knew they had COVID, the disease that had killed doctors and nurses in other countries, that was already causing ICUs and intensive care units up and down the country to start to look after their own members of staff. And your every instinct, all your training, everything made you want to go in and help those patients. That's why you're a doctor. And at the same time, a little bit of you couldn't help but think they're literally breathing out the virus. That means 2 nurses in the John Radcliffe are in intensive care at the moment, and we don't know if they're going to survive. But interestingly, you just parked that and just got on with your job, and not because anybody was brave or heroic at all. Those labels, I think, possibly do more harm than good. You just had a job to do. The one thing you did make sure you would do when you got home from work every day, you would obsessively strip off all your clothes, wipe down the door handle, wipe down your car keys. If the kids came towards me, I remember the first time I came back from hospital, I shouted at them to get back because I was so scared that they might come over and touch me and I would infect them with what was a deadly disease. So I was certainly more frightened of infecting my loved ones than the theoretical possibility of being infected myself. Somehow you just didn't allow yourself to go there. We're really familiar with intensive care as the apex of the pandemic. That's the most photogenic part of the hospital. Everybody knows about patients intubated on ventilators, but of course the vast majority of patients never went near a ventilator, and the vast majority of people who have died from COVID, and it's now nearly 180,000 people according to death certificate data, they were far too frail or elderly to be able to withstand treatment in intensive care. You have to be very fit and robust to ever have a chance of getting off a ventilator if you've been put onto one. And those patients, if they were in hospital, they died on the ordinary medical wards, and that's where I was based. And so it was pretty tough because you would go to work and you would see the same kind of patient over and over again, usually elderly, frail, suffocating, not able to breathe. They're having a kind of slow motion failure of their respiratory system. And all you could do was give them oxygen and hope that you could buy enough time for them to recover. And if that wasn't the case, then my skills as a palliative care doctor were incredibly important, because we would use drugs to palliate the symptoms, the breathlessness and the fear that goes with that. And we could do that very, very well indeed. It never needed to be the case, it has never needed to be the case that anybody had to suffer at the end from COVID, except that everything happened so quickly and often wards and staff were overwhelmed. So it was a really tough time, and I would go to work and know that I was going to have the same conversations, see the same kinds of patients over and over again. And there was something very dizzying about the idea that this one individual man or woman in front of me that I was trying so hard to help was, I knew, being replicated on wards in hospitals up and down the country. That was a sort of, it was almost hard to bear that thought. There was one scene that struck me, and I think for me is the vignette that somehow sums up the cruelty, the specific cruelty of COVID. And it actually was a scene in the car parks of the hospital. Ordinarily, hospital car parks are completely full, and you usually have people almost coming to blows, literally fighting for parking spaces. There are never enough of them, and of course the car parks were completely empty, except I started to notice you'd always get 3 or 4 cars in the car park, and they would be pointing right at the entrance to the hospital, and there'd be someone sitting in the car just motionless, staring at the hospital. And I realised what this was. This was loved ones, family members of somebody inside the hospital that they desperately, desperately wanted to be with, and they couldn't, that our doors were closed. And so they got to that point of physical proximity that was as close as they could get, but they couldn't be there at the bedside of their loved one. And I found that enormously poignant, because that urge when you're frightened or in danger or in pain or suffering, what you want is someone you love close to you. You want someone to be there, preferably holding you like a parent might hold a child and comfort them. And the infectious nature of COVID denied us that very primal human instinct to be in tactile proximity to each other, and that seemed just spectacularly cruel. We had to do things like bring in family members and help them into their PPE. So sometimes I would help children into PPE so that they could say goodbye to their parent who was dying of COVID. And I'll never forget once helping 2 little girls into PPE, and they had put on their party dresses because they wanted to look beautiful for mummy. And as they went off down the corridor and I'd helped them into their mask and their gowns, I saw their gowns, plastic, just trailing on the floor behind them, because of course you don't get child-sized PPE. So really, really tough. But the flip side of that is we very, very quickly realised that one of our most important jobs was to try and fight against that cruelty of COVID, the way in which it cleaves us from one another at the very point when we need each other the most. And we, as the healthcare professionals who were there with the patients, we needed to try and provide the humanity at the bedside. And so we would sit with patients. I would always try to find out a little bit about patients. I would phone up their wife or their son, find out something about them. When I could sit with them, I could show them that I cared about them as a human being, not just as the patient in bed 8 with COVID. We would have family members send us letters that we would sit and read at the bedside of patients, or playlists, favourite songs or poems or recordings. And we would try so hard always to make sure that if somebody was succumbing to the disease and they were losing their life to COVID, they would never ever do so alone. They would always have a doctor, a nurse, a healthcare assistant, somebody there at the bedside sitting with them. And it wasn't easy trying to convey humanity in these most barbaric of circumstances where everybody is covered by a mask, a visor, a gown, but we tried very hard to do it. And I suppose for me, the saddest aspect of the pandemic was the realization that for our patients who came in and didn't survive COVID, from the moment they arrived in hospital, they were destined never to see a human face again, because everybody they encountered, their face would be covered by a mask. And that's wrong. Every bit of you recoils against that. So that's a little bit of what it was like. Very, very tough, but remarkable in other ways. I mean, the strength and the dignity and the compassion that everybody showed, not just staff, but patients themselves and family members, was mind-blowing. And I used to go to work every day and think, I am seeing the absolute best of human nature here. Sometimes patients would say to me or the nurses, you have to look after yourself, you have to make sure you don't catch this. And I would always think, how can this person in this desperate situation possibly be thinking of others? But they would, over and over again. It was mind-blowing, and the support from the public was equally mind-blowing. I used to come home and sometimes I'd be sort of driving past the rainbows in people's windows and see the little NHS flags and so on, and I used to just cry sometimes because I knew this was a real, sincere expression of gratitude and solidarity from all of us. We were all in this together in a profound sense, I think. I learned two fundamental truths from my pandemic experience. The first is that in medicine, and I think probably more broadly in life in general, it's easy to make trite, fluffy observations about the importance of kindness and love in our society. I cannot bear it when somebody cynically co-opts the language of kindness for their own nefarious ends. And I am thinking of certain politicians when I say that. I hate it when that language is used cynically, but through this pandemic, from the word go, it seemed to me that although intensive care, all of the high-tech environment of machinery in an intensive care unit, although that was the kind of central focus of the pandemic as we watched it on television news, there was another kind of intensive care that was the most important thing in the pandemic, and it was intensive care of the humankind. It was all of us in the NHS just trying through our words, our tactility, even if our hands were gloved, our human impulses to try and reach out to patients and ensure that they knew they mattered, they knew we cared about them, and they knew that however bad things were, they were not going to be alone in the hospital. And for me, ICU is a very specific thing. It is I see you, my patient, and I think of you and I care about you as a human being, and I'm going to do everything I can as your doctor to help you, even if all I have is myself at your bedside and oxygen and nothing else. I see you and I'm going to try and help. And the second thing that I think I took from the pandemic is bizarrely encapsulated by a quote from Stalin, probably apocryphally, but that quote where supposedly it was Stalin, I don't know if it's really true, but the quote where he said, the death of one man is a tragedy, the death of a million a statistic. Whether or not that was Stalin, it's a very, very apposite quote for a pandemic, because you probably all remember the kind of horrible white noise of those daily death tolls. Today it's 500 people, tomorrow it's 1,000 people, just these astonishing, giddy numbers of deaths every day. It's almost impossible to comprehend that, and it does become white noise, a kind of background grimness to everyday life. I had the exact opposite of that in my working life through the pandemic. I had one individual patient, one human being in front of me, and then another, and then another. And I was incredibly grateful to have that focus, because the statistics were unbearable. But if I could just drill down onto this human being in front of me and focus on them, I almost had a way of maintaining my sanity, because I felt as though I was helping this person. There was nothing I could do about the white noise, but this person mattered. This leads on to my political conclusions, though. that fact about large numbers of people becoming amorphous and something that it's very easy to lose focus on and start to see as nothing more than a statistic, I think has been a theme of the pandemic from the very earliest days. You'll probably remember that in March, pretty much, what's the date today? It's the 4th, not quite yet. So in 8 days, so 2 years minus 8 days ago was the day, I can remember it very vividly, the 12th of March 2020 was the day that the phrase herd immunity exploded on British consciousness. Herd immunity in medicine meaning something very specific about the way in which vaccinating a population ends up protecting everybody, whether they are vaccinated or not. But herd immunity became redeployed at the start of the pandemic as essentially, quite explicitly, a strategy for managing the pandemic, which was to essentially do your best to protect vulnerable people, but accept that this virus was going to spread through the whole community of the herd, and a certain proportion of the herd was going to die as a consequence. It was quite remarkable when that phrase appeared in the press on the 12th of March. There was an astonishing visceral backlash to that phrase and that strategy, and very, very quickly the government denied ever intending or even saying it in that sense, but they did. And actually, as events unfolded throughout 2020, it became abundantly clear that there was a vast mismatch between what was being said about vulnerable people and what was actually happening to them. So early on, there was much warm talk about cocooning the vulnerable, protecting the vulnerable. We will shield vulnerable. In actual fact, what that translated into was vulnerable people, so elderly people or people with immunosuppression or another reason for being particularly susceptible to infectious disease. Essentially, it meant they had to stay at home. And if their home was a care home rather than their own individual home, then what that meant was no one had thought about them at all. So in the early days of the pandemic, it was taking around 4 or 5 days to get a COVID test result. We didn't have any functioning testing, and we had patients coming into hospital who we suspected had COVID. We couldn't get them tested, or if we did, we were awaiting a result, and we were told to just send them back to the care homes. And we knew that if we did, there was a very grave risk they would then infect other people in their care home, but we were told to do it. And actually, it wasn't even as simple as that. We also knew that if we kept Mrs. Smith, aged 85, in the John Radcliffe for the 5 days it was taking to get the test result back, then that may be the death of her, because she may catch COVID from someone in the bed next to her. So it was an absolutely impossible set of circumstances. And what we realised very, very early on in March was that nobody had given this a second's thought. No one had thought about the 400,000 people who live in care homes in Britain. So the language of herd immunity was very quickly suppressed the moment it emerged in response to the public backlash, but it was absolutely the case that the herd, the British population, was essentially divided up, I believe, into 2 tiers. There was tier 1, the people who were young and healthy and perhaps economically productive enough to be worth saving. And then there was tier 2, the vulnerable people, the people with disabilities, with lots of medical conditions, or the very elderly. And they were the second-class tier of people that essentially were expendable, were to be sacrificed for the rest of the herd. Of course, the government would strongly dispute that analysis, but in many, many ways, I think it was borne out. My conclusion is that, and I think this relates to everything we're seeing in Ukraine actually at the moment, it's that bearing witness is one of the most powerful tools we have in a country, whether it's a democracy or not, to try and ensure that society's most vulnerable members are protected and are respected and are taken seriously. If you bear witness, as we did in the NHS, inside the hospitals, you actually see the language that is spoken about groups of people, about patients with COVID, other patients, vulnerable people. You see that language translated into real flesh and blood in front of you. When you bear witness, your testimony is very, very powerful, and it's also very dangerous because it completely cuts away empty political rhetoric, and it completely subverts narratives that are, whether intentionally or not, propagated through the media. You are bearing witness, you can tell the truth, and it might be partisan, it might be partial and subjective, it's only what you are seeing inside your hospital, but it is what's actually happening in the real world, rather than a story that somebody wants you to believe about what's happening and about how much people matter to a government in a society in times of extremis. I'll end with one thought. It's always struck me that medicine and politics and journalism are all fundamentally the same in one sense. They're all about storytelling, telling a story. In politics, if you can tell an emotionally seductive story that at least appears to be factually based, that's a wonderful way to earn yourself political power. Obviously, the media is about storytelling, and in medicine too, fundamentally, as a doctor, your job is to listen to the story that a patient is telling you. It's to try to read the patient's body almost as a text and try to understand the meanings that physical text, this body in front of you, is revealing about what is wrong with them and how you can help them. And then it's also crucially about telling a story back to a patient. So sometimes at the height of the pandemic, my main job was communicating a narrative to patients that they mattered and their lives were important to me and meant something to me, and there was a human being here who was trying their utmost to help them. All of that is storytelling in the most profound sense, and perhaps at times of social upheaval where lives are at risk, whether it is a war, an invasion, or a pandemic, that's when these three kinds of storytelling collide in the most profound sense. And I think we all bear witness in some way to our own little sphere of reality, and documenting that and communicating that testimony is an immensely powerful tool that we all have and should deploy as vigorously as we can. Thank you very much.
So we've got plenty of time for questions. Before I open it up to everybody here, I just want to check. I can't physically see Sabrina who's manning the computer. So
lean this way.
Do we have any questions?
Not yet, but I do again invite our online participants to please pop questions into the Q&A. But I think it's too emotional at the moment to.
Do weigh in vigorously if you do.
I will.
Okay. In that case, yes, Simon.
Thanks for a great talk. Just linking back to what you were saying before about stories. Obviously, there's a lot of coverage in the media as well about conspiracy theories, and I guess what started out as conspiracy theories about the virus and then sort of evolved into conspiracy theories around the vaccines. What do you think it is about that story that made it so attractive for what was not, which was quite a large proportion of people, or not an insignificant number of people, to take that narrative and take it as fact?
So I've thought about this a lot, and I'm somebody who, like a lot of NHS staff, really experience a lot of abuse and hate online for, first of all, having the temerity to say COVID is a real and deadly serious disease, and then secondly, to say we have these incredible ways to protect people with COVID vaccines. I never thought I would get death threats or be threatened with rape, or my children threatened, or be told that I needed to be hanged and needed to bring back Nuremberg for doctors, simply for saying those things. And I think it's very, very interesting. I'm not an expert on the propagation of conspiracy theories, but I am an expert on what people are like when they're afraid. Because of my job, I meet patients and families every day who are very, very frightened that in the case of patients, by definition in palliative care, their life is imperiled by their particular illness. And when people are frightened, they are immensely susceptible to the stoking of those fears, and I mean we're probably all familiar with this. When our emotions run high, we're irrational, aren't we? Almost by definition, we're partly emotional, partly rational, logical creatures. I think the pandemic for everybody has been a frightening time. Whether or not you believed you were going to get COVID or die from COVID, everybody experienced their life being overturned in very drastic ways. And I think everybody lost something. At one end of the extreme, you might lose your life or the life of your loved one, your child or your parent. But at the other end of the extreme, even if you couldn't go to work every day, you lost your ordinary social structures of working in your office or your factory, whatever it might be. If you were a kid, you lost everything that matters and is important about your school life. People lost their capacity to feel positive, optimistic, anxiety-free in the world. Your mental health issues soared. So everyone lost something. Everybody had to confront upheaval. And I suspect, therefore, most people on some level were frightened, at the very least uneasy, but probably more so frightened. And I think that once people are frightened, they're so vulnerable to malign actors who are looking to deliberately stoke disinformation. So I think with COVID, the most inexcusable example of this is the way in which the anti-vaxxers have targeted pregnant women. So as someone who has been a pregnant woman twice, and also as a doctor, I know that when you're pregnant, you often exist in a state of heightened anxiety because you're aware that everything you do normally in your life could theoretically harm your unborn baby. You are gestating a creature that you have responsibility for. You have responsibility for their health, them emerging as a healthy human being. So you're enormously anxious, and I remember, worrying about everything I ate and obsessively washing my hands and all those sort of things you do because you just want to make sure you don't harm your baby. So when you look at the anti-vax disinformation, the targeting of pregnant women is so cynical and so malicious, deliberately saying, if you have this vaccine, you will triple your risk of miscarriage, or you will statistically cause birth defects in your unborn child. And all you need to do is sow the hint of a seed of doubt in someone to then make them fearful of having a vaccine. You don't need to persuade somebody that your lies are true. You just need to sow the seed of doubt. And so I think that's partly why the disinformation has been such a problem, because society as a whole, all of us have been frightened and discombobulated, and everything has been overturned. And also I think nobody likes their freedoms being curtailed, and we went into the pandemic very, very united in terms of willingly foregoing our freedom to do absolutely what the hell we liked to protect other people who were more vulnerable than us. But obviously, as time went on, that started to fracture, and more individuals started to kick back against their freedom being curtailed. So yeah, I think those two reasons maybe.
I think we do have an online question.
We've got two, should I just say them together?
Yeah.
Okay, great, so.
I'm going to come over as well.
Sorry,
It's too disturbing.
John would like to know, could you point to the top element of support that the government could and should have done better? And Kathy asked, what do you think about the huge waiting lists that have built up because of COVID? How can the NHS recover?
Good questions. Not easy to answer quickly, but I'll try. So the first question, so obviously there's lots of things that would have helped, like having adequate amounts of PPE would have been good in the first wave, and having built up testing capacity from January through to March, that would have been quite useful as well. It would have been really helpful if we didn't go into the pandemic in the first place with one of the most heavily understaffed health services in the rich developed world. So we have one of the smallest numbers of doctors per capita of any country in Europe, and the same for intensive care beds. So all of those practical things would have helped. But for me, the single most important thing that the government could have done throughout the pandemic, which they didn't, that I believe would have been immeasurably valuable, is, it might sound very naive to say this, very old-fashioned, but it's to actually be honest with the public, and in particular be honest about mistakes that were made. It's very, very hard to be furious and angry and bitter towards somebody if they say to you sincerely, we made a mistake, we should have done this differently, we're sorry, it's a pandemic, we're always going to get things wrong. But instead of doing that, the government doubled down on some of their mistakes in a way that directly has led to significant loss of life that perhaps could have been avoided. So we went into our first lockdown late, several weeks at least after people were crying out for the country to be locked down. That is, you could argue, an entirely forgivable mistake. I wouldn't want to be a prime minister in a pandemic. I would be terrified of making those decisions. What's unforgivable, in December of that same year, when all of the scientists were united on stage in saying, you need to lock down, we are heading into a wave that's going to be so much worse than the first one. What's unforgivable is making the same mistake twice and saying, you know what, we're just going to ignore you now. We're not going to even pretend that we're following the science. We're going to talk about having a 5-day holiday over Christmas when everybody can see each other and have fun, when the scientific advice was, if you do this, people will die. So I personally treated 3 generations of one family, so son, father, grandfather, all dying of COVID, one after the other, one family, and they all caught it from each other at Christmas. So not learning from mistakes is the unforgivable thing. That's what they should have done differently. And then the question about waiting lists. So we've got over 6 million people now on waiting lists. Nearly 1 in 10 of the British population is currently on a waiting list, waiting for their hip replacement, their knee replacement, their cataract surgery, vital life-changing procedures. That's absolutely terrible. It's really difficult because partly that's due to COVID, partly it's due to what I've just referred to. So the waiting list even before the pandemic began was 4.4 million people. So only 1/3 of the waiting list has been caused by COVID. Although the narrative is emphatically, this is a COVID problem, it's not our fault, it's caused by the pandemic. It actually was a huge problem before the pandemic even began. And there isn't an easy way to solve it quickly because we don't have enough doctors, nurses, all the other healthcare professionals. But long term, the way to solve it is to radically invest in the NHS workforce. And that's not just about increasing training places for doctors, nurses, paramedics and so on. It's about addressing the terrible issues around retention of staff, so people just leaving, getting burned out and quitting. There's an awful lot that could be done to try and address that, I would argue. I won't get into that on the
Rachel, I thought that was absolutely marvellous. Thank you very much. I mean, as you're aware, I mean, in the university, we're all very proud of how our colleagues worked with AstraZeneca to produce the vaccine. And of course, we agreed at the start that we would give that vaccine to the whole world at cost price. I've had 3 lots of comments over the past 15 months. One, often from fairly wealthy people, venture capitalists, and some of our alumni, saying that the university made a mistake, we should have charged for it. And I've never really known how to respond to it. Secondly, I've had people from Médecins Sans Frontières contact us and say, we should have given that license not just to AstraZeneca, but to lots of companies all over the world, etc. Of course, the reason we didn't do that was because we wanted to be sure of the quality of the vaccine, and it's not easy to produce, etc. And also because if we'd given it to everyone, AstraZeneca wouldn't have spent billions scaling up even before we had clinical efficacy data. And then the third lot of comments I was amazed by was the politicians last year, Macron, etc. This vaccine causes clotting, etc., etc. And I'm sure John Bell's right, but that has led to lots of people not taking it and dying as a consequence. So, did we do a bad job telling that story?
It's fascinating, isn't it? And if anyone's interested in this particular issue, I think that Sarah Gilbert's and Catherine's book, so 2 of the scientists, the leading scientists behind the AstraZeneca vaccine, they've written a book provocatively called Vaxxers, as a sort of stand for science and the science behind vaccination. It's a really wonderful, enthralling book that touches on all those issues. And I mean, isn't it fascinating? Because in a way, all those 3 sets of comments speak so strongly of how powerfully the way in which a story is presented to the public it affects what actually happens to patients in the real world. And you know, Macron's comments are the most striking example of that, that somehow, and maybe the roots of those comments could be traced back to Brexit, it certainly felt like that at the time, that somehow because of sort of domestic sabre rattling and attempt at one-upmanship between countries in Europe, somehow because politicians were unable to rise above that, people literally died of a disease that had a vaccine that could have saved their lives. It's just mind-blowing. So because of Macron's comments, perhaps people in Kenya chose not to be vaccinated and died from COVID directly because they didn't trust the vaccine. I find that astonishing. And I don't know what the solution is. You can try, all you can do is try to tell the truth. You have to try and tell a story that is based in truth, and you can't manipulate or spin the story, because if you do, you're just playing into the hands of people who then want to spin it further. I mean, one of the issues with the AstraZeneca vaccine, the first point at which I think people started to lose faith in the vaccine and doubt it was when the first efficacy data were published, and we have this peculiar glitch where a lower dose of the vaccine seemed to be more protective against COVID than a higher dose of the vaccine, which doesn't make intuitive sense to the public. And so I think immediately that gave people the opportunity to start to suggest that AstraZeneca was spinning their data and so on. Incredibly difficult, and I believe that for all the misinformation that's out there, people are good at recognizing sincerity. Even when a politician tries to present themselves as you know, man of the people, I roll my sleeves up and I drink a pipe with you ordinary voter, I think people are pretty good at recognizing that for what it is, and you have to have faith in that, and you have to believe that for all the people trying to manipulate the story, the public has a good grasp of what's real and genuine and sincere. I don't think that's a very good answer to your question.
I think the one that I've been most struck by, and this happened to me last night, I was in Keble, and a number of people said the university made a mistake, we should have charged, we would have made a fortune. You know, Pfizer made 30 billion in the first year, and Moderna made 20. So here we're trying to do something to save the world, frankly, and we're being criticised.
Yeah.
But these people are not scared, they're completely, you know, this was yesterday, last night. Yeah,
but you did the right thing. And there are many, many thousands of people who recognise that for what it is. There'll always be people looking at the bottom line, but I mean, we're all charitable in some sense, aren't we? We all act for the greater good as well as ourselves. You'd be a psychopath if you didn't, and yeah.
Yes, question back.
I'm quite interested in the long-term psychological impact of the whole pandemic and what lockdown did to us. And I'm not sure we've even begun to realise the effect that it's had. I'm just interested to hear what you think about how we now go forward, having gone through that collectively.
I completely agree, and it's very interesting how if you compare this pandemic to the Spanish flu pandemic, it's remarkable. A lot of historians have commented on how little the Spanish flu pandemic impacted upon national consciousness moving forward. So there was not much written at the time. The Spanish flu and the deaths of people with Spanish flu were not memorialised publicly in a sort of dramatic and enduring way. And I think that's very, very interesting because it suggests somehow that we, when faced with a collective trauma, we just want, we have a powerful instinct to just say, okay, don't want to ever go back there again, that was bad, let's just move on. I think in that respect, it's a little bit like national childbirth. You just, okay, let's just move on and focus on the positives. So we've clearly been through a collective trauma, and one of the ways in which psychologically as individuals we respond to trauma is by suppressing it. So I am regularly encountering people at work now who are having to seek treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder and the psychological sequelae of suppressing the trauma that they have witnessed on those COVID wards. And I suspect collectively we're doing something like that. And again, I think the layers of loss just these multifaceted ways in which we have lost so many different dimensions of our ordinary lives through the last 2 years has been quite shattering. I would say that's my own experience, I suspect for many, many people. And the grief aspect alone is shattering. So some research that was done towards the end of 2020 looked at the grieving impact of COVID deaths, and shows that for every person who has died from COVID, around 9 people are significantly affected, so will have significant grief as a result of that. So that's well over 1 million people, that's 2 million people in the UK who are or have experienced a significant grief reaction. So that alone is an astonishing social artifact, and we're not talking about it. I feel as though we almost need group therapy at a nationwide level, and I suppose it will come out. So we've already had some books, we will have documentaries, we will have dramas, we will have cultural ways of looking at the last 2 years, but perhaps it's too soon. Yeah, it's enormously worrying. And of course, the greatest worry is we're talking as though this is entirely past tense, and we have no idea if it is. Can't even go there. We have to assume it is at the moment.
Yes,
First of all, thank you for such a fantastic talk. I wanted to ask about the government's recent decision to remove the legal requirement to isolate and to essentially remove testing in the community apart from targeted people. Do you think that was the right decision to make, and do you think now is the right time to do it?
So I was very upset by those decisions at the time. I think that they were premature and in some specific ways. So I touched on herd immunity and the ways in which vulnerable people were sort of talked about in these very cotton wool-like terms. We're going to protect you, and actually in many ways we're just thrown to the wolves. I think that one of the worst things about those announcements was the fact that there was no plan in place for how clearly extremely vulnerable people were going to be protected once we did away with the legal requirement to isolate. So there's about 150,000 people in that category, and what happens to them. At least if people had communicated to them first and explained that this is how you can get strong, powerful antiviral, anti-COVID drugs if you get COVID because you're vulnerable, at least they might have felt as though they were being supported by their society, by their government, but that didn't happen. However, clearly coming out of a pandemic has to happen at some stage. It's always going to be harder than going in. Going in, you're just reactive, you're firefighting, you're sort of responding to events as they come at you. Coming out, you are having to weigh up and evaluate in a very self-conscious way when to start to loosen the restrictions. And there was always going to come a time when we and every society in the world would need to do that. We can't live our lives locked down and masked and testing daily forever. It would be nice to hope that the timetabling of that might be dictated, at least in part, by the science or the advice that the scientific experts are giving the government, rather than perhaps the urgency dictated by trying to make all those nasty headlines about Partygate and boozing in Downing Street go away. One suspects that the timetabling was driven to a great extent by the latter. However, so far so good. Deaths, hospital cases and cases are all still going down at the moment. obviously testing is going down as well, but the fact that deaths are still going down, that's a hard fact. That's very encouraging. It shows the impact of vaccination, antiviral treatments, and the Omicron variant being much less virulent. So there's a lot to be hopeful about at the moment.
I think I'm going to fumble this question, so bear with me. But there was something that you said that I've just been sort of thinking about. And you said, you know, you said first of all that the worst effect that you weren't being heroic, which I kind of disagree with what you've heard, right? But then you said that you managed by thinking you were doing your job. Now, one way that might be interpreted is in a strange way that you're reducing yourself to your labour power. I mean, you did say your PPE, right? So I can ask, you know, you were kind of shrinking down to a cog in the machine or something of that kind. You also talked about how in experience you enlarged your job through advocacy, through social media, that it got sort of bigger, the boundaries expanded. And so I just wondered what you meant by doing your job. And then secondly, whether that, and this is already a question for now as well, whether that left you anywhere outside the job, outside the work, outside of COVID, where you could just, you know, shut the door and be a different sort of a person. Does that? You know?
No, I do. You didn't fumble the question. I think I've understood it anyway. So when I said you're just doing your job, I suppose I meant something very specific by that, which wouldn't have come across in that phrase. For me personally, and I think a lot of doctors feel like this, your job as a doctor is fundamentally to help your patients, this patient in front of you and the next one. And weirdly, you're never allowed to say that in interviews for medical school. As a sort of sixth former wanting to get into medical school, you're always told, under no circumstances say you want to help people, that you'll never get into medical school if you do. I decided to go into my interviews and say, I know that you're not meant to say this, but it is the reason, and I'm not going to say anything else because I'm just going to be totally honest. It was a good strategy. I got into medical school. So if that's the heart of your job, which it certainly is for me, I mean, that's why I became a doctor. That's why I carry on being a doctor. I love, it's not selfless. I derive an enormous amount of fulfillment from the daily act of doing my job with patients, trying to help patients at the end of life. If that's your job, the essence of your job, then going to work doing your job is simply, in this very, very blinkered way, still doing the same thing, despite the fact that the air around you is filled with COVID. You're just going to ignore that. So I think it's almost the opposite of commodifying yourself, because I'm talking about an essence of, the essence of doing my job is actually an ideal in a way. It's an ideal about how you're interacting with patients. So that's why there's no conflict between me doing my job and me also enlarging my job. So it's very strange. I think this is because I used to be a journalist, and so I came to medicine believing so strongly in the power of testimony and stories to bring about change for the better, for the good in the world. I've always believed that my duty as a doctor to try and help patients expands beyond the patient in front of me to encompass writing articles for newspapers, speaking on television programmes, being very angry on social media, because if the intention is the same with all those activities, if it's all about trying to help vulnerable patients, it's all just one and the same thing. I don't think all doctors should do that, although it would be great if more did, but it's all the same activity. So, and then in answer to your other question, I think it's fair to say I didn't have any space at all to be anything else, and that was very hard. So I found the pandemic, weirdly, very strangely, sometimes the easiest moments for me as a sort of frontline pandemic doctor, seeing a lot of people dying from COVID, some of the most straightforward moments were the ones actually on the wards with patients, although they were enormously stressful times, because there was a clarity of focus about what you were doing, and you were almost subsumed by the job in a way that liberated you. You didn't have to think about anything else. There was no time to indulge your demons, you just had a job to do. But coming home, I would often kind of almost look at my husband and my kids as they told me about running around outside and you know, not doing homeschooling and eating nothing but Pringles all day, and I would feel as though I was sort of slightly disembodied hearing about this world that was so alien. I felt so detached from it. I found it hard to identify with, and I wasn't ever able to switch off. I was always thinking about work, not sleeping, found it traumatic. And the most traumatic moment of all was the lead up to the second wave, so to January this year, when we knew it was going to happen before it happened. We knew it was like being in a car crash and swerving across the road. You could feel the death coming, and you knew that the government wasn't taking the difficult actions that could stop it coming, and there was nothing you could do to stop it. And I think for me, psychologically, that was the hardest thing about the pandemic. It wasn't actually looking after the patients, because I saw so much of what is remarkable and amazing about human beings at work every single day. As we're seeing with all of the footage from Ukraine at the moment, it's horrific and unimaginable, but people are being remarkable every moment of every day in Ukraine right now.
So I want to say, first of all, thank you so much for this talk. It's just been an amazing opportunity to hear from you. So when we did go into lockdown about 2 years ago, I was 16, right? And a few months in, as chinks in the government's armor sort of started to appear, what I noticed that me and a lot of my friends and my community generally would do is say, well, we can't listen to the government now, and sort of use it as a justification to go out and do whatever we want and violate lockdown rules, etc. And I see that, like, even now, a lot of people around me aren't vaccinated. When I ask, obviously they say that, you know, they almost attribute like the lack of trustworthiness of the vaccine to the government, as if it's like necessarily the government that creates the vaccine. And so what my question is sort of, who do you think, if not the government, we should go to for information about things like the vaccine, things like why, you know, you mentioned Statesman before, so why we should, you know, follow lockdown rules, and more importantly, how do you think we can foster like a separation between those other sources of information and the government, so people don't just say, well, we can't trust the government, let's sort of do whatever we want?
Yeah, great questions. And I think, I mean, this is exactly why governments playing fast and loose with the truth that is so damaging and harmful and corrosive, isn't it? Because once you don't trust a government, you don't get your vaccine, and then you end up in intensive care with COVID, and it's very understandable that you haven't got your vaccine, because why should you trust these guys? And I guess on that particular issue, it's even more complicated than that, because sometimes I think the government's attempts to shape our behaviour in the pandemic have backfired terribly. So, for example, if you are telling people that, so if you remember July of last year, we had so-called Freedom Day. Freedom Day was, yeah, you could rip up the walls, we're not locked down anymore. If you're telling people, if you're literally using the phrase Freedom Day and reveling in the sort of populist hit that comes from being the champions of Freedom Day, why would anyone still get vaccinated? Because on the one hand, you're telling them, you're free now, you don't have to worry about this disease anymore. And on the other, you're saying, but still get this vaccine that nasty people on Twitter are telling you are going to cause infertility or your testicles to fall off. Why are you going to get a vaccine when that kind of stuff is being spread across the internet, when you've got a government saying it's Freedom Day, you don't need to worry anymore? So I have great sympathy with people breaking rules, and I have great sympathy with people not getting vaccinated. One of the saddest things I think in the whole pandemic has been the really nasty, kind of vicious attacks on people who are choosing not to be vaccinated, as though somehow those people are either stupid or worse, selfish and don't care about other people. I know many people, some of them doctors and nurses in the NHS, who haven't been vaccinated, or at least haven't had a booster, say, and that's because they're genuinely frightened about vaccines, or they've had a really bad side effect of the first one and now they're scared of having a second. So I don't have a simple answer to your question, but it's undoubtedly the case that the more we allow ourselves to attack each other, give in to the divisiveness, criticize people, accuse other people of being selfish or stupid because of X, Y, Z, they won't get vaccinated, they won't wear a mask and so on. All you are doing is making yourself part of the problem. The number of NHS doctors I've seen on social media being vicious about people who won't wear a mask and who won't be vaccinated has just saddened me incredibly. I am entirely vicious about anti-vaxxers, as in people with power who know exactly what they're doing and are trying to manipulate people into not having a vaccine, for instance. But they are very, very different to the vast majority of the public, who are, everybody's basically trying to do the right thing, right? We're not, very few people are really fundamentally selfish. We're all selfish in some ways and good in other ways. And we're all, to varying degrees, trying our best to be decent. And I think the moment you stop giving people the benefit of the doubt and you start assuming that their motives are malign, you're never going to win hearts and minds. You're never going to persuade people to do the right thing. I would love to believe that the NHS is a good example of an institution that is far more trusted than the government. And I would love to believe will continue to be trusted, because obviously doctors and nurses are in that job because they care about patients, and patients fundamentally are people. So that's a good example of an institution that maybe is more plausible as someone to listen to than the government. But these institutions, the BBC is another one, precisely because they have that quality of being trusted by the public, you could argue, so they have been challenged by the government, and their veracity has been deliberately challenged by the government, who this government doesn't like alternative narratives about their policies. So it's very, very difficult. Yeah.
Right, well, I think we're just about up to time. So thank you so much, Rachel, for and thanks so much to everybody for all the questions as well. I think that's about all we've got time for. There's nothing else on.
No, nothing else on the chat.
So in case everybody's just to thank you all, and especially thank Rachel.